Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Michael Nacht, who is Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. Professor Nacht teaches and writes in the fields of U.S. national security and foreign policy and on management strategies for public organizations. He was a founding co-editor of the journal International Security, and he served in the Clinton administration as Assistant Director for Strategic and Eurasian Affairs of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Dean Nacht presently serves as Chairman of the Secretary of Defense's Advisory Committee on Terrorism and Weapons of Mass Destruction. Michael, thank you for being here today.
Great to see you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New York City, grew up there, went to public schools there, went to NYU in New York, studied aeronautical engineering. It was then called aeronautics and astronautics, and then began a career. I graduated relatively young at age 20, left New York, and went to work at a NASA lab in Ohio. That's how I started my professional career.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, my parents were both born in New York, and their parents were all born in Europe, in Lithuania and Romania. And I think that they had a kind of what scholars would call a realist view of international politics. They were not particularly political, but they did sort of keep up with current events. And my father in particular was a small businessman and was very practical. And I think that sort of practical sense was transferred to me.
Mm-hmm. And when did you start getting interested in world affairs and so on? You started off on the engineering track.
That's right. I was very technically oriented, and I really had very limited knowledge. I had not traveled abroad at all. I traveled throughout the U.S., well, into to neighboring Canada. Mm-hmm. That was my extent of one trip to Montreal. Mm-hmm. When I went off to NASA. And I guess I just was reading in the newspapers about it, and it sort of was attractive to me. And then, of course, I was there as the Vietnam buildup began. Mm-hmm. And I had a...
You were where now?
I was at NASA.
I see, at NASA, right.
And I had a deferment,
I see.
a so-called critical skills deferment, which was available then. Mm-hmm. And I became very interested in the whole business of the buildup, and then the use of force, and then the anti-war movement, none of which I was a part of. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the first stimulus to my international interests.
Yeah, and so at some point you put aside that and went to Columbia to do a PhD in political science?
That's right. I had done some graduate work at Case Western Reserve, again in technical areas, and then went to work at a consulting firm back on the East Coast. And the consulting firm had a project on conflict forecast studies. Mm-hmm. And that really was my first professional experience of any kind related to international affairs. And I was thrilled and taken by it. And I said, whatever this is what I'd like to do. And that led me ultimately to go to Columbia to get a PhD.
Mm-hmm. Now, what in your background prior to that graduate education had prepared you with skills that later proved useful in the kind of work you were doing? I mean, was there anything in your previous education
Yes.
or life experiences?
I think there was some. I think an engineering education is very valuable. In engineering, you're forced to sort of brush aside a lot of the complexity and isolate a core problem area, mm-hmm. and then try and develop a set of tools and techniques to solve a problem. And it lends to a kind of clear, logical way of thinking about things, which I think is valuable. Also later on, because I did get into national security studies, which deal in part with military weapon systems, mm-hmm. I have some familiarity with their feasibility. Mm-hmm. Because I have some technical knowledge in some of these areas. So I think that was valuable as well. So I would say those were the two elements from the technical side that helped.
So what then are the skills required to do public policy, foreign policy analysis? What sort of training does a student need, or what sort of aptitudes should they, or temperament should they possess over and above their education?
Well, I think a part of it should be a willingness to suspend one's beliefs and look at the data, and have the skills to analyze the data. Now, data in this field comes in many colors. So part of it is through quantitative methods of analysis. Part of it is just understanding how political systems work and how bureaucracies work. When a president makes a speech, what might be behind the speech. Having a sophisticated understanding of how that works. You can learn that, but there's almost nothing like seeing it in action to really appreciate it. But you have to be somewhat inquisitive, and you have to be willing to suspend your, to some degree, your belief systems till you see how it works in action.
And what does a School of Public Policy teach other than these quantitative skills and learning how to research a problem, I guess?
Right. Well, there's a core curriculum. It's basically a public sector analog to the private sector, to an MBA. So there are courses in microeconomics, because a lot of the issues in public policy are resource allocation issues. How much money do we put into which area? And microeconomics is enormously powerful to answer those questions and to understand economic behavior. But we also teach courses in political analysis, in public management, how to manage in the public sector when there's no profit motive. We also look at the role of law and public policy, because law is such a powerful tool, especially in democratic societies. So it's a mixture of those tool courses, and then the rest of it are substantive courses in areas of interest. They may be health policy, they may be criminal justice, they may be social policy, housing, race relations, affirmative action, those kinds of things, or they could be in foreign policy and national security.
Now, is there a difference, or what are the differences, if any, in doing public policy in what we might call domestic domains, domestic areas, housing, health, versus doing policy analysis and work in national security and foreign policy? Is there something that distinguishes that foreign policy, national security realm?
Yes, I think that the data is less well developed in the foreign area. It is in some ways more politicized. You have very prominent and intelligent people on completely opposite sides of the fence who are not willing to compromise much at all. I also think that the degree of personal animosity that can develop in the foreign policy realm is much more intense than in the domestic realm. Maybe that's because I've spent most of my time in the foreign policy area. But and I think the reason for that is that the people who are engaged in these debates believe that it is literally a matter of life and death. It is literally a matter of the survival of the society that we're discussing here. And therefore, they're not very tolerant of views that don't conform to their own. Whereas others will say, well, you know, if this approach to welfare reform doesn't work, it'll fail, and we'll try again in a few years to adjust it. I don't think it quite has that intensity, but you know, it may well be that people who worked on those issues over many years believe that they encounter as much intensity as I have in the international area.
My next question actually relates to what you just said, but let me ask you, what is the greatest obstacle to making rational national security policy in a democracy? Is it what you just said, or is there an added dimension to it?
I think there's an added dimension the way the policy process works. A new administration comes in with a set of ideas, and it's very hard often to implement a lot of them, because the whole governmental structure of the United States is designed to make it hard to get anything done. That was what, I think in many ways, the Founding Fathers had in mind. They were trying to protect against a tyranny, and they've succeeded. So you have tremendous competition within agencies, across agencies, and between the entire executive branch and the Congress. You also have now, in the American democracy, a plethora of other players that play a role. whether it's the press, which of course has always been very powerful, or the think tank community, which has mushroomed tremendously since the 1960s, or university scholars and other organized units within universities. They all play a role, and as well as the military and the industrial sector. So it's a very complicated set of players that are involved in this. And they tend to produce an outcome which may not make fully sensible, they may not make much sense to anybody. It's a kind of compromise. It's a resultant force in a physics sense of a compromise among many different competing interests.
And what about public opinion in this equation? It would seem that the public somehow is more susceptible to not understanding the issues, because in many areas related to foreign policy, they don't have to do with things that they really know about, or what we might call bread and butter issues. Is that an element in all of this?
I mean, I think that administrations and people in politics, of course, pay attention to the public. They both seek to influence public opinion, but they are also influenced by public opinion. I don't think it is correct to accept the statements often made by people that, oh, we don't care what the public thinks. That's not true. But the public is slow often to decide these things. And it's American public warms up to these issues. And if it becomes a hot button issue, they become quite well informed about it. And of course, our whole system is geared to informing them. We have this tremendous media of all stripes with all of its problems and all of its weaknesses. It's a fantastic resource. It's the fourth estate. It's an essential element of our democracy. So after a while, the public does form an opinion. And if that opinion becomes very, very pronounced in one direction or another, it's very hard for an administration to go against it. But that may take years. And the whole name of the game, especially in national policy, is, what's happening this afternoon.
I'm interested in the role of ideas in foreign policy and national security policy, and how new ideas develop, and what are the institutions and processes by which that happen. Now, you were a founding editor of a very important journal, International Security, which came at a particular point in our history, I think after the Vietnam War. And so
right, just as Vietnam was ending.
Yeah, tell us a little about the founding of that journal and how it came to be, a factor in the foreign policy discussions, at least among the technocrats and intellectuals in the field.
Well, it's an interesting little story. I'll condense it, but I had the good fortune to be at a major place, Harvard University, when I received my PhD, after I received my PhD. And I was part of a center there that dealt with security and arms control issues. And this was at a time in the mid-'70s when even thinking about these issues was still almost verboten on many college campuses, because the anger over Vietnam was so intense and so long-lasting. And an important figure at Harvard who doesn't get the public attention he should, Paul Doty, a very distinguished biochemist, had a dual life. His other life was in these fields of security and arms control. And he persuaded McGeorge Bundy, who by then was the president of the Ford Foundation, to provide a major grant to start a center. And part of those funds were used to start this journal. And the rationale behind it was that there wasn't any journal that we saw in the field that could do really publish serious, well-documented, data-based, analytical, scholarly work in this field. There were important journals. Foreign Affairs, of course, was an eminent journal for decades, going back to the 20s, but often one of commentary or of major national figures offering advocacy of their positions. It wasn't really a research journal. Foreign Policy had been started only a few years before we started ours, and they had some research articles, but also many articles of commentary. We really wanted to primarily attract the serious analyst, the scholarly community, And the people who really wanted to look into the details, who wanted to read an article with 75 or 275 footnotes and a lot of charts, and we were not unwilling to publish any of that. Now, of course, that meant the market would be small. And I think even today, international security has maybe 6,000 or 8,000 subscribers, and foreign affairs may have 200,000 subscribers. But I think we did fill an important niche, and I was associated with it as long as I was at Harvard till 1984. And I think it's a terrific journal 20 years later. It's a wonderful journal for the serious student of these subjects.
And do journals like that put ideas on the table before they have a currency in say in Washington or in the public debate?
Absolutely. I mean, these are most. I haven't done a sort of content analysis in recent years, but most of the authors in this journal are in the university community. There are some who are not, but most are. They're not necessarily involved and wedded to the details of day-to-day Washington machinations or what's going on at the UN or elsewhere. But they're standing back and looking at a lot of material from scholarly sources, and they're building models, they're making analytical judgments, and they can easily be ahead of their time. Sometimes their time never comes, but it's very, very, very valuable. And they're constantly, of course, as the scholar does, testing and retesting hypotheses, challenging conventional wisdoms, overthrowing paradigmatic ways of thinking. This is, of course, the very nature of the intellectual enterprise.
You mentioned McGeorge Bundy and the Ford Foundation, and I'm curious as to what sort of grade you would give the foundations. I know that in earlier careers you've done a lot of consulting, and maybe even today, evaluating the work that has been funded and so on.
Right.
Generally, would you give a good grade to the foundations in terms of anticipating problems? It's obviously easy to put the money into a set of inquiries after something has happened, but
right.
not always easy to do it before.
I may be too close to this community. I've been associated with the American philanthropic community and to some degree some others in Germany and Japan for, as you say, almost 3 decades now. Look, they're not perfect, but they are, I think, an essential element to the whole way the American system works, because, first of all, there are a lot of smart people who work in these foundations full-time. They are not merely receiving ideas from prospective grantees and then providing funds. They are often generating the ideas and saying, we would like some work done in this area. They often generate their ideas through conversations with scholars and people in government and elsewhere. So they're like a fifth estate. They're another key nodal point in the network. And I think they funded a lot of very interesting work, path-breaking work. Of course, as a percentage of all the things that they funded, probably it's not that high. But you can't expect tremendous mega hits every time. I remember there was work done on the role of nuclear energy in the 1970s that was funded by Ford. And the Rockefeller Foundation has done path-breaking work on public health in sub-Saharan Africa. There's been work funded by the Carnegie Endowment on the Carnegie Corporation of New York on the sources of internal conflict. These are all very valuable studies. And not only that, they not only fund studies, they support people, fellowships, visiting appointments, the establishment of research centers in many fields. The major centers of study in the field of international security today in the United States, and not only in the United States but elsewhere, at Harvard, at Stanford, at MIT and elsewhere, at IISS in London, they're all based on Ford funding, almost everyone. And if not Ford, then on the other American foundations came through. So I don't in any way underestimate the importance of the American philanthropic community. Which, by the way, I should add, is really unique. I mean, there's very limited, there are very few examples of a comparable degree of philanthropic spirit in most other, even the richest countries in the world. I mean, Germany has a few major foundations now, many more than they used to have, which is, I think, a great sign. Japan has just a couple. France has hardly anything. Britain has very little. Most of the other European countries have very little. And outside of that, there's almost nothing, because they're the poorer countries. But so I think the United States philanthropic community is very, we have a lot to be thankful for what they've done.
You're uniquely situated to give us a perspective on the dichotomy between theory and practice, especially in the national security field, but public policy generally, between the way the books tell us the system works and the way it actually works. And I would like to draw on your experience in the government to help us understand that dichotomy better.
Right.
So is what you read and studied, did it prepare you for what you learned when you actually went to the Arms Control Disarmament Agency?
It prepared me, but incompletely. For example, I think in a lot of the literature and in the whole scholarly community, there's a tendency not to dwell on and to weight very heavily the importance of individuals. One looks at macro forces and ways of thinking. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing it or I'm doing it, it'll come out the same way if it's in a certain context. What I found on the ground, whether I was in Washington or Moscow or Beijing or in Petra, Jordan, which is some of the places I was in during my tour of duty in government, is that people matter a tremendous amount. And it does matter whether you're in charge or whether I'm in charge, and whether it's your set of ideas that's the driving force or not. So that's one thing. Now you might say, boy, that's a kind of trite observation, and people matter everywhere, but somehow I think I was not prepared to appreciate how much they matter. A second point is that some of the bureaucratic politics literature that's in political science, I think, is even more important and more visible when you're in government than you appreciate if you're not in government. And it's, except I would modify to some degree some of the paradigms that Graham Allison and others articulated, which largely discuss the role of agencies competing with each other within the executive branch. I think the most important thing that I observed, which I have not seen in any of the literature, maybe it's in a piece I haven't read, is what I call ideological cohorts. There are people with a kind of set of value systems that are common. They have the same value system, but they don't work in the same place. Some could be in the press, some could be on Capitol Hill, some could be in the State Department, the Defense Department, the Arms Control Agency when it existed, it's now part of the State Department, and elsewhere. And they all have a kind of similar view of things. This becomes a powerful kind of congealing force because they actually even collaborate with each other, even though it's sort of not part of the rules. Opposed to them is another cohort with diametrically opposed or markedly different views that is equally across agency lines. So sometimes the struggle is not defense versus state or executive versus congressional. It's ideological group A versus ideological group B. And then the media and others, people in academia, are used in a way as pawns to justify these arguments. That's a very powerful force which I have not seen in the literature. Third point, which is in human affairs, people make mistakes. I know, I'll just speak for myself. I've made many mistakes. Partly inadvertently, partly maybe deliberately, partly for lack of information, partly because I rushed things. Well, the same thing happens in government. And I think scholars tend to sit back and look at a government policy and assume it's almost like a Tiffany diamond. It's like perfectly created. It may be all screwed up, but it was all, every part was intentionally constructed in exactly the way it comes out. And then they try to develop all kinds of theories about why, to justify this. Why, they may not like it, but to explain how did this happen. And oftentimes it's not the case. It was rushed. It just was scribbled on a napkin. I mean, you know, it's hard to sometimes say this, but it's the truth. I remember one time, and I won't, I'll spare you the details and camouflage the people, but I was in a situation where a doctoral student gave a very elaborate theory of why a very eminent Secretary of State once got off an airplane and made a statement about another country very far from where he had just landed. It all had to do with signaling and this and that. He drew a lot of interesting evidence from the theoretical literature. He made a very powerful case. And then after he made the presentation, someone said, would you mind if I comment on what your dissertation was about? He said, because I happen to have been in the airplane with the secretary when that was developed. And I'd like to tell you what happened. And of course, what happened had nothing, nothing whatever to do with this beautiful, powerful, very persuasive theoretical insight. So I think there's a lot of happenstance. There's a lot of this sort of stuff, a lot of stuff that doesn't work as well as one would like to think it does in the real world. That's not reflected in the literature, and you just have to realize that, and you have to sort of roll with the punches. You have to understand when you can take initiative and when you better sort of stand back, when you understand what the rules of the game are and when you think the rules might be shifting. And it's tricky. It's subjective. It's often non-quantifiable. It's hard to stay abreast of this.
Now, in the government, you worked on the problem of the nuclear arsenal of Russia after the end of the Cold War, and the whole set of problems related to making sure those weapons were dismantled, secured. So in a way, you were dealing with a problem that one could say, I think fairly, that the political system really didn't in its entirety understand how important it was until after 9/11. Is there any thing in particular that we should talk about with regard to the frustrations of trying to carry the ball on a problem, building coalitions across institutions among like-minded people, as you just described, that was involved in that work?
Sure, that's a great question and a really tough subject. I would say after the Cold War was over, which was the time and before 9/11, which is the time I served in government, it was a period where we were in some way searching for a new center of gravity for what our foreign policy was about. And we knew that it was important to get rid of this material, to secure it, because Russia clearly had all kinds of issues there. They had scientists who weren't being paid properly, and facilities that were not being guarded properly, and all the rest. Some people said, it's not important. Who cares? Now, ultimately, because of Senators Nunn and Lugar, a lot of funding, in relative terms, was provided for this. But that just gave us the chance to try to work the problem. That left, even if you could escape Washington with a mandate to do something, it was another thing to persuade the Russian government to do something. And the Russian government had many reasons why they didn't want to cooperate. Because even though you might think, well, why wouldn't, here the Americans are going to come over with their own money in a way and help the Russians secure their own weapons. But, the Russians felt terrible after the Cold War ended. There was a sense of a defeated nation. I was in Moscow in the early and mid-90s, and it had this tremendous sense. I bet it must have been a bit like Weimar Germany after World War I. Not a shot had been fired, but they were defeated. And the last thing they wanted was sort of the very upstart, cocky, full of themselves Americans coming over with their cash and saying, we're going to help you solve your problem even though you don't even know you have a problem. So there was a lot of resistance. There was also concern, I think, in Russia that there was a big intelligence operation. We were just there to find out exactly what they had. And there was also questions of protection of bureaucratic turf. The major organization, MINATOM, which is sort of equivalent to our Atomic Energy Commission, is hugely powerful in Russia and controls a lot of the nuclear materials. And they were very uncooperative with our efforts. So it was very, very difficult. I can't find English language words to emphasize enough how hard it was to do this. But things were done, and some material was put in safe places, and all the nuclear weapons of the other former Soviet states was removed from Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. And I can go on. A number of things were accomplished, but no step was easy. Every step was tough. And then after 9/11, we see that, of course, for those who want to use weapons of mass destruction, this is a tremendous inventory. It's a tremendous playground. And it's even more vital than ever before, as you say, to get this stuff under control.
Now, one other aspect of your work in government I want to touch on before we talk more about 9/11, and that is you were involved in preparing for a number of the summits between Clinton and Yeltsin, and then also setting up the first one of the first summits, or the first summit between Clinton and the Chinese president. And I'm curious about that process as a learning process for leaders, either on our side or on the other side, but also as a way to then get decisions made that shake up the system so that you get a mobilization down both, there in the other country and here. Talk a little about that.
Well, first of all, of course, it's a great thrill and a great honor to be involved in a presidential summit. Not many folks get to do that, to meet with the president, to meet with his counterpart. But it's a very tough process in preparation because the White House, whoever the president is, the White House controls the process. But they need input. They need input from the other major executive branch agencies. Now, of course, it also depends. Some summit meetings are very short and telescoped on one or two issues. In a number of the summits I was personally associated with, and especially reflecting President Clinton's style of wanting to deal with many, many issues, there were several major issues on the table. So just to get your input into the papers, just to get your oar in the water, so to speak, was not an easy task. And it took a lot of working the system, so to speak. There's a process, but then there are ways to try to work around the process to get your voice heard. Sometimes it can't be your voice, but it could be somebody else's voice who is articulating the view that you support. So ultimately what's put together is a briefing book and a set of talking points for the president. Often what happens in these summits too, and it happened, I saw in firsthand experience, there are a number of negotiations for some of the key agreements that are done not by the president. Because the two presidents can't sit there and negotiate 12 or 14 different agreements. It's just not feasible. First of all, they don't want to do it. They're not really that knowledgeable about all these issues. They have a big picture view. So I was engaged in a number of the negotiations at lower levels with the foreign minister of Russia to iron out things which ultimately the two presidents would acclaim as an agreed presidential statement. But it's a fascinating experience, and it's one of the things I treasure most about my time in government, just actually being part of it. I remember one of the early ones, if I could just go on for 1 minute, which actually combined a couple of things, because it was a Clinton-Yeltsin summit held at Hyde Park, Franklin Roosevelt's home. So it had not only the electricity of a Yeltsin-Clinton meeting, but in this incredibly important historical site. And it was a beautiful fall day. And it was actually not long before I had joined government, not long after I had joined government. And it was just a very special experience for me to be there.
Tell us a little about Clinton as a leader who could grasp issues of great complexity in a short time frame. Was that the case with him?
Yes. I think really even his deepest opponents, and he had many, and we really felt it in the government, would acknowledge that he was a very smart man who was, to use the phrase, a quick study, who could grasp the key essence of an issue and know what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. Because, there's limited time in these meetings. It's not a casual conversation. You go there to meet with the head of state of another country. You want to get certain things done. That person wants to get certain things done. They have an agenda. You have an agenda. And, you can't spend 27 hours there talking about, I don't know, soccer scores or other things. It just doesn't happen that way. There's a certain amount of socialization, fraternization, just to sort of warm up, sometimes more than with others. I mean, for example, Yeltsin and Clinton happened to hit it off well. And they became kind of drinking buddies. My impression of the Clinton-Jiang Zemin relationship was it was very formal, and there was none of that. Clinton was able to do that. He's extremely forceful across the negotiating table. First of all, he's a big man. He's a big man, so with a big head of hair. He looks right at you, as is widely known, and he's just very articulate. And when he gives this presentation, he has tremendous command of the material. I think this is really an honest presentation, because I was in the administration. You may or may not like what he was trying to do, but the notion that he had command, I think, was seen by all.
So as a dean of public policy, I guess what I'm hearing you're saying, if you were to be, doing his grade, was that he combined the kind of analytic skills that would be the ideal product of an education at the Goldman School with a kind of a sense of with a political instincts for moving it all forward, whatever was on the table.
Right, I would agree with all that. If I had to offer two caveats to his A grade in this area, I would offer these. One is that his attention span was short. He wasn't gripped, to my knowledge, by any one or two or three issues in international affairs, or maybe even in all of public policy. So therefore, he hopscotched, I think, excessively. He gave insufficient time to a few issues. He didn't, in some ways, prioritize enough. And interrelated to that, but somewhat distinct from it, is I think he wasn't sure, especially in this post-Cold War era, precisely where to put the chips, what the priorities were. He came in with a clear idea. He'd been told, and I think he'd been persuaded, in the future, in the post-Cold War world, international economics was the future of international relations. The role of force was now declining. Military affairs were not that important. Alliances, all these classical issues of power politics, they were no longer where it was at. But then he found a necessity to use force in Bosnia and Kosovo and Haiti and Somalia, sometimes with good effects, sometimes with disastrous effects. Gunboat diplomacy in the Taiwan crisis, concern about North Korean missiles in '98, confrontation with the Chinese. So he learned over the course of his presidency that conception was not accurate. Of course, international economics is important, and it became in its ascendancy. But at the same time, military issues of a different form were taking shape. And of course, what was looming on the horizon, but we really didn't fully appreciate it to 9/11, was the role of the transnational group, the international terrorist organization that could not just put a hole in a U.S. ship in Yemen and kill 17 sailors, which is bad enough, or blow up some embassies in East Africa, but could kill thousands of Americans in their workplace.
Let's talk now about the post-9/11 developments in the context of what we've been talking about, ideas, bureaucratic politics, and so on. I think because of the media, we have a sense of how 9/11 affected the public. But I wonder if you can give us some insight in how it has affected the national security establishment, both the political leaders and the national security technocrats or intellectuals. In other words, what has that event meant for them in sort of shaking them up?
Right. Well, I think it's definitely energized them. It's terrorized them. Some of their worst nightmares have been realized. And I think that many now see this war on terrorism as kind of the organizing principle of the post-Cold War world. That basically we had a Cold War for 45 years, and then we had about a 10-year period of something which we couldn't put a label on, so we called it the post-Cold War world. And now we're in this age of I don't know what you would want to call it, whether it's extreme terrorism or whatever. But clearly, we have a situation of people who are deeply hostile to the United States, deeply hostile to Western values, and they're willing to not only use force, they're willing to kill themselves to implement their policies. And this is a threat of a character and scope I don't think we fully appreciated till 9/11.
And is it that that many of these issues were being considered by intellectuals or policy wonks in off here in the corner and so on, and that now everything has opened up and the importance of what was being said in some places in the government is quite apparent?
Well, I think there has been a bit of a flip-flop. I mean, I think, frankly, until 9/11, just in terms of sort of career prospects, whether you were in academia or you were in government, if you worked on the sort of major powers and the major players, this is where the action was. This is where you would be rewarded. This is where the best minds seemed to be. This is where the most interesting things were about. Whether it was about our potential adversaries, Russia and China, or whether it was about Europe and NATO, whether it was about the Japanese, of course the horrible Middle East conflict, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has gone on really since the inception of the State of Israel in 1948. These were the key issues.
In China, too.
Yes, I said Russia and China. But terrorism was viewed, I'd say, as an important but secondary issue. It was interesting. It could lead to deaths, not huge numbers, but, a businessman could be killed in Colombia, and, even the World Trade Center could be attacked in 1993. But it was second order. And, it really wasn't something where you could become a superstar in the field. There were directorates set up to study terrorism in all the major agencies of government. They were never chaired by people who rose right to the top. That has now changed. Now that becomes the essence of the challenge. Unfortunately, it's not the only challenge, because the other problems haven't gone away, as we've seen with Iraq or with North Korea. So you have a kind of dueling situation here of competition between those who think that international terrorism is the problem versus those who think state governments who are hostile to the West is the problem.
Without saying that you were a clairvoyant, I'm curious, do you in retrospect feel that you were more sensitive to these issues because of the portfolio that you had working with Soviet nuclear weapons, or not really?
Frankly, no. Frankly, no. I don't think that what was orchestrated on 9/11 was something that I believed really could happen. Now, I know I've read since that George Tenet warned President Bush of a catastrophic attack on the United States, on the territory of the United States, by bin Laden as the top priority of his presidency. So he obviously had information that I was not aware of. But I would say he would be among the very few who would have put that at the top of the list. Emerging tensions, even potential conflict with China, absolutely. Still dealing with a Russia that had not fully democratized and that seemed very corrupt and that had mafia characteristics and all that, absolutely. A need to somehow move towards some sort of peace settlement in the Middle East, absolutely. This was sort of the classical agenda, slightly modified in the post-Cold War world. This thing, again, as I say, it was the magnitude of the forces that are arrayed against us, what to do about them, and their willingness to kill themselves. Martyrdom terrorism, I think, was not appreciated until 9/11 on a wide scale. And now, so as we were talking, I guess, before the program about paradigmatic shifts, I would think if Thomas Kuhn was here, and I said, not to say, I guess he passed away a while ago, but almost all of us have read his book on the structure of scientific revolutions and then tried to apply it to this field. There was a paradigm, and it really was sovereign states were where it was mostly at. There were important other sides, and there were many scholars who talked about transnational relations and international organizations and all that, but they were like the cauliflower, but the major powers were the steak. And now it's the whole dish is being scrambled. It's more like a souffle, and it's not quite clear what the steak is. And in particular, this whole question of the role of Islam. We are so ill-prepared to really deal with it, because our knowledge is limited. There are only, what, a few million Muslims in the United States. There are very few in any positions of authority in the federal government or in the Congress. We have to understand the whole religion, value system, to understand what is relevant from that whole system to what happened on 9/11, what is irrelevant to it. There were already major debates among scholars as to how much of this really reflects Islam at all. Some say it's just a total aberration. Some say it's not such a total aberration. And then what to do about it. And I think we are just in the embryonic stages, the nursery school stages of this terrible problem.
If there are two ideas that have much greater salience, if that's the way one can say it, after these events, which are ideas put on the table as new ideas, or if they were out there we didn't know that much about them. One is the Bush Doctrine on preemption. As somebody who has spent a lot of time on weapons of mass destruction, help us understand what is new about that doctrine, and also in what ways it does or doesn't make sense with regard to these new challenges.
I mean, we have a kind of self-image, not shared by a lot of the rest of the world, that we really are the good guys. And part of our definition of being a good guy is we don't hit unless we get struck. We retaliate. We're not the kind of group that goes in and clobbers somebody first. Now, in fact, if you look at the details, there are a number of counterexamples to this, whether it's the U.S. invasion of Cuba or the Philippines, which was related in part to what William Randolph Hearst was trying to do for his own newspaper circulation, whether it was even later on with an attack on Libya. I mean, in many other cases, it's not so clear that the U.S. always retaliated. In a number of cases, we did take preemptive action or preventive action. By the way, there's an important distinction there, which is being blurred in this debate. I mean, I take preemptive action against you if I think you are about to attack me and I beat you to the punch before you kill me. Preventive action is I think you're developing a plan and a set of capabilities to attack me, and I want to destroy that. It may well be that, in fact, the possible use of U.S. military force against Iraq is really preventive action, but it's being billed as preemptive action. Because at least as far as we know from the public domain, there doesn't appear to be a set of capabilities to attack the United States or its allies that's on the front burner there. Now, what is different and has been so much influenced by 9/11, and I think is the basis for the powerful language used by Bush, some would say jingoistic, nationalistic, but it's very powerful, very clear language, is the notion that there are people and groups and maybe even countries, maybe even governments, that are willing to use weapons of mass destruction to kill thousands or more Americans, even if they themselves know they're going to be killed. Now, you may accept this, you may reject it. The Bush administration happens to believe that this is the reality. And they say, you know, we have a choice. And our choice is to wait until we are attacked and then respond, or to try to find these, as Bush says, the worst people with the worst weapons and deal with them before they attack. And that is the basis for the preemptive strategy. I think it's very risky. It's potentially very dangerous because it could provide a rationale for many other countries to do the same thing against their favorite enemy.
So, for example, India against Pakistan.
Exactly. And we don't want to see that happen. So I think Bush is actually going to be very cautious in the implementation of this. And by the way, there's another, going back to some of your earlier comments about what one learns from the time in government. What governments say and what governments do are not identical. And you know what? They've never been identical. So we have this grand strategy, we have this preemptive strategy. Now we're faced with this terribly difficult problem with North Korea. A difficult and very dangerous problem. I've spent time in South Korea. I've been in the demilitarized zone. I've met with people who've been with the North Koreans. I can't tell you how dangerous this is. But Bush isn't, 3 months after the announcement that they've resumed their nuclear program, bombing the heck out of North Korea. They're not doing it. Why? Because there are too many other mitigating factors. It's very dangerous. It can lead to the destruction of Seoul. It could lead to destruction of U.S.-Japan security relations. There could be all kinds of ramifications.
And also endanger American troops.
And of course, we have 37,000. So, you know, we have a strategy, and we use it. We implement it when we think we can, and when we can't, we don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. And this is the way governments work. You need some organizing principles, but then every case is a little bit different. It's almost a little bit like a football team, I don't want to trivialize the point here, but a football team has a game plan. They have a whole series of plays. Mm-hmm. They have everybody has their job. They know what to do. Then they get out on the field. The first play, they look at the defense. No one thought that the defense would line up that way. Time out. We've got to change things already. Mm-hmm. This is what any administration does. You come in with a game plan, and almost from the beginning, the game plan has to be altered. In some sense, I think the Bush administration didn't have a very clear game plan for the first 8 or 9 months, other than to sort of rebuild the military even more, although the military actually was in quite good shape. The military that was used in Afghanistan was the Clinton military. And to talk tough, to get away from some of these nation-building ideas, and to focus on a few great countries like Russia and China. That's what they said. And now look where we are. Mm-hmm. We're all over the place, and we're trying to get the Turks to agree on having U.S. bases there, and we're rebuilding in Afghanistan to certain degrees. We're quite a far cry from where Bush's original proposal was. So it is important to look at the policy. I'm not trying to diminish its significance, but I wouldn't say it's a precise game plan of what we will actually do.
One other area that seems to be a major change is another area that you've worked in is arms control. I mean, the administration seems to have pronounced arms control dead on arrival, and is moving more aggressively toward a defense with regard to missiles that, although it doesn't necessarily seem that it will work, seems more compatible politically with the present environment. Right. Talk a little about that demise and what we should watch for, you know, as that policy evolves. Right.
Well, I think arms control, as it was originally envisaged and was implemented all the years of the Cold War, is something that this administration did not think. First of all, they weren't fans of it during the Cold War, but they certainly don't think it's applicable in this new world. Now, you know, we may actually come to terms with North Korea in some way. There might be some kind of quid pro quo here, some kind of deal may be struck. It may not be struck in a formal negotiation. It may be, you know, people walking in the forest late at night, or having tea in a cafe in Vienna or something, you know. It won't be that kind of formal business. But there will, I'm hopeful, because the alternative could be war, I'm hopeful that a deal will be struck. You know, that deal will probably lead to some kind of reduction or constraints on the nuclear weapons program of North Korea. What is that? That's arms control. Mm-hmm. It's just arms control in a very different wrapping with a different color ribbon around it. But it's not the kind of thing that the administration has espoused as being useful. Many of the folks in senior positions in this administration believe that arms control is kind of a misconceived notion. That, you know, those who you can reach agreement with to really constrain weapons are not threats, and those who you can't achieve agreements with are threats. So why do you bother? Mm-hmm. In other words, we don't care whether the British deploy X or deploy Y. We don't need an agreement with them. Mm-hmm. They're very cynical and skeptical about the value of arms control. I personally, of course, have spent a fair amount of my time in this field. I think that that's short-sighted, but that's the past. That's sort of the history of arms control in the nuclear age. The question is, how can it, threat control, threat reduction, how can that be implemented today? If you don't like arms control, I'm happy to put that term aside. Threat reduction is being used. We have a whole agency in the Defense Department called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and they're looking for ways to reduce the threat. So I don't think the idea is dead, but it's being refurbished and polished and revised in certain ways.
So what seems to come to mind as you speak is the old adage that somebody in one of the previous administrations has said, don't listen to what we say, but watch what we do.
Exactly.
Some variant of that.
Right. I mean, it's true on a number of the key agreements, the administration has been very negative. And after all, the President has exercised the United States legal authority to withdraw legally from the ABM Treaty. And they have chosen, of course, not to pursue any furtherance of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and in many other areas outside of arms control, like the Climate Change Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and the International Criminal Court, and I'm sure many of your viewers know the whole litany. They have not been fans of these treaties. But I bet you'll see, if the Bush administration carries on, at some point they will have to resort to some degree to international legal instruments. It's an element of diplomacy, which is an element of foreign policy. They may not do it exactly in the way it's been done in the past. You may not like what they're doing, but I don't think it's going to be thrown out. And clearly Secretary Powell is supportive of this, and he's an important voice in the administration.
One final question. How would you advise students to prepare for the future in terms of their education, either at the university or elsewhere? Mm-hmm. We know you think they should get a degree from the Goldman School, but beyond that, what advice would you give them?
Well, you know, a couple of years ago, we had Condoleezza Rice as our commencement speaker. And she didn't speak at all about foreign policy. This is before the Bush campaign really got underway. She spoke about the role of the policy analyst. And she offered one bit of advice, which would be one of my two answers to your question. That was, read things that you know you don't agree with. You know, if you're a rock-ribbed conservative, read The Nation. If you're a very liberal person, read, I don't know, National Review or something. Educate yourself about the views of those you think you disagree with fully, because there are serious people with a lot of data and information and arguments that are on that side, and you better at least understand what they have to say, even if you don't support it. You'll need to do that to refute them, and you may wind up changing your mind a little bit about some of these issues. So that's one thing. In other words, cast your intellectual net widely. Just don't keep work in the same area. Surround yourself with people, all of whom think the same, articulate the same, read the same publications, watch the same programs and all that. That would be one. The second thing is, just of a general nature, travel if you can. Travel widely, travel outside the United States. See what real people think and how they live in different parts of the world. As I mentioned to you at the beginning of the program, had not traveled. I traveled extensively in the United States, but had not traveled outside the United States really till I was an adult. In fact, till I was married with young children. Now, many years later, I can say I've been in many, many countries. And it's one of the great benefits of my whole personal experience. I mean, I think I've sat down with people, sometimes in professional settings, and sometimes in, you know, a restaurant, and just see what people walk the streets, see what life is like. If you want to work in this field, in foreign policy and international affairs, you have to get there. It's different. Walking around Moscow is not the same as walking around Berkeley. It's not the same, and you won't know it until you're there. It's sort of like looking at a roller coaster versus riding the roller coaster. You may see it going up and down, you may hear the people screaming, but you don't know what it feels like until you're in that first car going down. And you need to do that. This is part of it, is sort of learning by doing. That's one of the thrills of being in this field.
Michael, on that note, thank you very much for being here and sharing with us your intellectual journey in the foreign policy field.
Thanks for having me, Harry.
Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.